I'm Nancy Cavey, National ERISA Disability and Individual Disability Attorney. Welcome to Winning Isn't Easy. Before we get started, I have to give you a legal disclaimer. This podcast is not legal advice. The Florida Bar Association says I have to say this. So I've said it, but nothing is going to prevent me from giving you easy to understand overview of the disability insurance world, the games the disability carriers play, and what you need to know to get the disability benefits you deserve. So off we go. Surveillance is the number one tool in the carrier denial toolbox. Companies like MetLife, Hartford, and Reliance aggressively use surveillance at every stage of an ERISA disability claim. Now, surveillance will help weed out the cheats. For example, in the case of Quarles versus Hartford Life, Hartford had the right to request proof of loss during the duration of the claim. Quarles had lied about working while he was collecting long-term disability benefits. He was observed on surveillance working, and he specifically denied that in an in-person interview with Hartford's field investigator. He even dodged employment questions during the interview. Quarles' claim was denied, and ultimately he appeared in front of a federal judge. And guess what he argued? He argued that surveillance was a malicious attempt to discredit him. The court thought that was a joke, and the denial of his claim was a slam dunk by the court. The lesson here is that a policyholder should be truthful in their activity of daily living forms and with their treating physician. If the disability carrier wants to take your statement, you're probably being set up for a claims denial. You need an attorney to prepare you and represent you in the claim. But there are often times when a disability carrier will wrongfully deny a legitimate claim or terminate a claim that's been paid for years. So let me give you an example. Michigan court rejects surveillance as meaningless, while a Kentucky court goes all in when the surveillance shows the disabled policyholder working. Now look, surveillance can be a two-way street. Surveillance should have some relationship to the policy's credibility and the standard of disability. But many times, surveillance shows the policyholder engaged in normal everyday activity. And so long as the policyholder has been truthful with their doctor and the insurance company, I think that surveillance is of little value. Well, let me give you an example. In the case of Carr versus MetLife, in this Michigan case, the court determined that MetLife's decision to deny those long-term disability benefits were arbitrary and capricious. Why? Well, MetLife had played games. They ignored and selectively reviewed evidence submitted by Carr's doctor, and they sent it to a peer-reviewed doctor by the name of Dr. Marcus Goldman. And without even examining Carr, Goldman relied on the surveillance and said that Carr was not credible, and he didn't believe that the claimant had any restrictions or limitations. Well, the court looked at that and said, oh, no. It's pretty hard to rely on a peer review report by a physician who really misconstrued, exaggerated, and purposely misinterpreted what that surveillance showed. Now, as I explained in that Quarles case, the court found that Quarles had lied and had exaggerated or rather minimized his activities. And really, I think one of the lessons to be learned here is that surveillance is a two-way street, but there are some more lessons to be learned. And so what I wanted to do today is talk about three things. One, how disability carriers use activity of daily living forms to set you up for surveillance. How disability carriers will use surveillance to attack your doctor's opinions about your restrictions and limitations and get your doctor to change their minds. And tips for attacking surveillance if you're the star in a long-term disability claim denial movie. So let's take a quick break before we get going.
Have you been robbed of your peace of mind from your disability insurance carrier? You owe it to yourself to get a copy of Robbed of Your Peace of Mind, which provides you with everything you need to know about the long-term disability claim process. Request your free copy of the book at caveylaw.com today.
Welcome to Winning Isn't Easy. Let's start with how disability carriers use the activity of daily living forms to set you up for surveillance. Video surveillance in the right circumstances can provide an overwhelming reason for the long-term disability carrier to deny your claim. It captures just a mere snapshot in your life, and it fails to reveal a complete picture of your disability. For example, the surveillance might show you at a family gathering, but not show the result of excruciating pain and misery that you might suffer for days after. Long-term disability carriers use surveillance to document what you're doing during the course of your day, including things like running errands, filling up your gas tank, or even going to the bank. All of this minimal activity doesn't necessarily establish that you're capable of working, but it can be used to sabotage your case. So I want to set the stage by telling you the story of Hall versus Prudential. And this is a Mississippi case that will explain how the game is played, regardless of where you live in the United States. So first, the disability carrier is going to ask you to fill out vague and open-ended activity of daily living forms. These are purposely open-ended so that you exaggerate or you don't tell the complete story of what your activity is, or you don't talk about a good day or a bad day. When the disability carrier gets your activity of daily living form, they are going to compare what you said to what you've told your treating physician about what they do. They're looking for inconsistencies. And once they find inconsistencies, the next step in their toolbox is going to pull out that surveillance camera. They're going to hire a third-party vendor to conduct surveillance on you. Now, part of the surveillance is going to do a background check, looking at your social media accounts and looking at whether you own any corporations, but they're also going to be doing the actual surveillance. And in Hall's case, the surveillance documented her taking short walks, drives of various lengths, and carrying her purse. As the court ultimately pointed out when they had this case, those activities would not on their own support the disability carrier's decision that she was not disabled. But what the surveillance did do was to establish inconsistency with her own statements, what she told her doctors and the restrictions and limitations her doctors imposed based on her statements. In other words, her doctors relied on what she said that she could do or not do when they imposed restrictions and limitations on her. And so the court ultimately held that because her doctors relied on what she said and she was inconsistent about what she was doing, that those restrictions and limitations were not valid. Now, that's quite a stretch, but it points out to you the importance of accurately completing the activity of daily living statement form in a manner that talks about good days and bad days, activities depending on how you feel, depending on what kind of night you may have had before, and talking about your abilities in terms of a range. And of course, you want to make sure that whatever you're telling your doctor is consistent with what you're telling the disability carrier. So you might even want to give your doctor a copy of your activity of daily living forms. Now, remember, those forms are written in a way that they're open-ended. So that form may ask questions about whether you use an assistive device like a cane. And if you do, you may not necessarily want to say that you always use a cane or that you always walk with a limp. Why? Because if the carrier gets surveillance of you doing what you said you couldn't do or never did, then you're in trouble because that is a huge inconsistency. While walking without a cane or a limp doesn't mean you can work, it destroys your credibility, just as it destroyed the credibility of Ms. Hall in her case. I don't want you to be a star in a surveillance horror show, and I don't want the pictures of what you are doing in your daily routine to be used in destroying your long-term disability case. And as a result of what I've seen in the course of my practice, I've written a book called 23 Mistakes You Can Make in Completing Your Activities of Daily Living Form. And it explains in detail how you should complete these forms. Now, of course, it's not a substitute for legal advice because each case is factually specific. But if you claim, for example, that you are walking with a cane, or you have difficulty bending, or you can only lift 10 pounds. So if you have a back condition, you've had back surgery, and you say, I can't walk, more than an aisle in the grocery store, or I can't bend over to pick something off of the bottom of the grocery store bottom shelf, or I can't even carry a case of soda, and they've got you doing those things, you have basically destroyed your case. So in this guide that I've written, I emphasize that you should never use the word never use the word always. Of course, I do want you to tell the truth, but we need to explain your answers in a way that creates this range that I've talked about. Good days, bad days, days you can do more. Your activity level is dependent on your pain or your medication. So that gives you a range of activities, as opposed to nailing you down to always doing something or never doing something. I want you to make sure that whatever you have written on those activity of daily living forms is consistent with what you're telling your physician. So you actually might want to get a copy of your medical records to see what your doctor has recorded. We go in and we give a history of what's happened, but that history doesn't always end up being either complete or accurate. So I always suggest that my clients get a copy of their medical records before they complete the activity of daily living form. Make sure that what they're putting on that form is consistent with what they've told their doctors, and that it's in a range, and that you also give the doctor a copy of the activity of daily living form so everybody is on the same page. The bottom line is, be truthful. Let's take a quick break before we continue.